to find out more about what Africa's been saying about the G20 Summit, I spoke to our correspondents in Cairo, Johannesburg and Lagos a little earlier. Let's start with you, Sumitra. How closely are South Africans watching President Zuma's movements at the G20 Summit?
Well, very closely for a number of reasons. The president represents South Africa and the continent as a whole as the only African member of the G20. And at a gathering of the most industrialized nations, together these economies represent 85% of global GDP. This meeting is very important for improving trade relations, looking at ways of improving growth and inclusive growth and influencing global economic policy. South Africa is in desperate need of foreign investment for job creation, unemployment, more specifically youth unemployment, which is rising at an alarming rate. South Africans want to know how President Jacob Zuma is pushing this agenda with global leaders, how he is influencing decision making and what he's doing to improve not only South Africa but the entire continent's plight. Apart from these issues, South Africans are watching the president's every move for clarity on what's happening back on home soil. As the president of the country's ruling party, the ANC, seems to be imploding, governance issues have come to the fore which have serious consequences for the economy and South Africa's standing internationally.
Now, yes, so Chinese President Xi Jinping invited President Sisi to the G20. How have Egyptians been viewing his trip there?
Well, it's seen here as a very positive step, even psychologically. Now, Egypt was one of the leading economies in Africa until 2011 at a growth rate that was exceeding 8% per year. And that was huge. And Egypt was on the path of being one of the major developing countries in the world. But it lagged behind in the last 5 years. And this visit and Egypt being with the G20 leaders, even as not as a member but as a guest, is a kind of a sign of belief that Egypt is on the right track to regain its status there, that there is potential in Egypt to work with, and that the economic reforms have been approved by many countries in the G20 and by the international monetary institutions, financial institutions. So everyone is watching the meetings and hoping that Egypt will come up, the Egyptian president would come up with deals or agreements with some of the leaders and the countries there to help in Egypt's plan to rebuild its economy.
And Deji, what about there in Nigeria? What are Nigerians saying about the G20 summit? How closely have they been watching events there?
Well, Peninah, Nigerians have been following events, even though I would say the followership has not been that overwhelming, because people are not so confident here that that the country would get any wonderful deal now from the G20 as a group. But the hope is that, the country may be able to strike some deals now with individual members of that group. The country is now in recession, and of course, anything at all, any help at all that could come from outside to help this country get out of recession will be very much appreciated. But the fact is that Nigerians are not overwhelmingly now looking at the direction of the G20, even though people have been following it, and people are just hopeful that something positive comes out, not from the group per se, but at least from the individual members now that make up that group, that the country may just be able to strike some kind of deal now that will help Nigeria now not just come out of its recession, but also deal with some of the problems. I mean, problems like Sumitra identified in South Africa, unemployment, for instance, anything at all, attraction of foreign investments and what have you, just to help Nigeria come, deal with these issues. But in terms of whether Nigerians are expectant that something is going to come out from the G20 as a group for this country, that expectation is quite low here.
Well, Sumitra, as the only G20 member from Africa, South Africa has been under a lot of pressure to represent the continent. Has it done that effectively?
Well, Peninah, there's mixed views on this. According to some experts, South Africa actually has no mandate from Africa to represent it at the G20. And this was noted after Nigeria took over South Africa as the largest economy on the continent. But being the most developed country on the continent, South Africa is more integrated in the global economy, has good, strong financial institutions, and has greater participation on the global stage. And by virtue, can't speak alone, but rather takes on a continental role. Some believe the country has done well to bring African issues to the stage. One example dates back to 2008 when the Committee of 10 was formed following a meeting of African finance ministers and central bank governors, and was really meant to amplify Africa's voice in global economic affairs. South Africa coordinated the committee, comprising several African countries taking Africa's concerns to the G20. South Africa has also pushed ahead with representing Africa's interests in fighting tax crime and participating in new global financial and tax regulation to stop the illicit flows of money, a huge issue for the entire continent. Some would argue that it's become a rather fine balancing act for South Africa, as it needs to consider its own interests before assuming the voice of Africa. Peninah?
Well, yes, so what is President Sisi looking to gain out of this summit, and not only in terms of the G20 as a whole, but also when it comes to individual countries like China?
Yes, there's a lot of cooperation, and if you talk about China, there's a lot of expectations with China. Just to give you some figures, only a year ago, Chinese investments in Egypt were around $500 million. Now over $5 billion, and according to the meeting between the Egyptian and Chinese presidents, they have talked about raising that number to 15 billion in a year. So there's a lot of at stake with China there, with the investments that Egypt badly needs for the foreign currency that has been dropping in the last 5 years. It needs that from foreign investments, need that for employment. And obviously there are countries like France that Egypt has meeting there, France, Russia, as well as Saudi Arabia. Those countries, Egypt is hoping to strike more deals with them, as they were the countries that have been helping Egypt in the last few years in its to overcome its recession and its political turmoil. At the same time, fighting corruption is a major issue for the Egyptian president in Egypt. It's a big issue here, and it has been a hurdle for development. And the Egyptian president mentioned that in his speech today, that he's happy to be part of China's international center for fighting corruption that has been established by China, and Egypt says it will work very closely with China on this. And the IMF, he met with the IMF chief Lagarde, and Egypt is looking at more cooperation with the IMF, especially with the expected loan of $12 billion that will help very much the foreign reserves in Egypt, that has dropped from 36 billion to 15 billion in 2 or 3 years. And that will be a big focus for the Egyptian president during his visits there.
All right, Deji Badmas, live for us in Lagos. Yasser Hakim, live in Cairo. Sumitra Naidu joining us live from Johannesburg. Thank you all for those great perspectives. Now, let's get you more perspective on the G20 Summit. Earlier, I spoke to Professor Macharia Munene, a Sino-Africa relations expert, and I started by asking him the significance of the developing world having so much prominence at the G20 Summit.
Yes, it is a sign of things to come, in part because the precedence has been set, and it was deliberately done. It was not accidental. It was deliberately done that the developing world should feature a little more prominently than has been the case before. The record of the G20 movement has been on an upward trajectory from the 1990s when it started, which in time it appears it is surpassing what used to be called the G7. So the G20 is an expansion of what used to be G7, which was mainly kind of a European thing. Now the G20 is a global economic forum for all the countries that are strong enough to affect the global economy. And in this sense, China appears to be in the forefront of that. And the impression given by China is that it wants, because it says that it is part of the developing world. It is the leading developing world. Some people would say it is a developed country, but it is part of that development. And so giving prominence to the part of the globe in which it belongs appears to be a key thing for it. And that's part of the reason why in this G20 forum, the developing world has been given that kind of prominence. Yeah.
Now, when you say the G20 hasn't done much for Africa, tell us more about what the G20 can do for the continent.
First of all, set the agenda. I think the presentations that have been made, the ones I checked, when President Xi was making his argument, one of the things he mentions, I think, is that we do need, the members of the G20, and there's one African country in there, that's South Africa, need to act in a concerted way on a number of issues. And one of the issues is the industrialization of Africa, the infrastructure. Now, if those members can agree on that as a matter of principle, then what remains is the implementation part of it. So that in itself is a major thing, if there can be an agreement on how to go about it. So that will be one outcome that is very positive in that. Of course, there are things that are taking place. You have a lot of bilateral diplomacy taking place, because you get about 30 heads of government and states in one city. Even if they don't like each other, they'll say hi to each other. That's good diplomacy. So, and we have about 3 African countries represented. South Africa itself is there. Then you have Egypt, you have Senegal, and the AU in the name of the chairman is represented. So those who are there can then even plug in for different angles that Africa can look at. As far as Africa is concerned, the main thing is not so much to ask for, to be promised some aid. It doesn't help much. But the obstacles that are there, particularly among the big countries, to African trade with them, if they can be reduced or removed, that will be a major outcome, or have a commitment that they are going to look into that. It will be very positive as a result.
Right, several African countries have been affected by this sluggish global economy. How soon will countries such as Nigeria start seeing results after this summit?
The summit in itself will not remove the sluggishness, but it might start a process. Because the meeting is really an economic one on how to stop further deterioration of the global economy. A lot of it depends on how China behaves, because it is currently the engine, the economic engine of the world. So when there is sluggishness on the part of China, the others get affected. But there is also that interesting debate that has come up, I think from the European boss, Juncker, telling them, slow down, you are overcapacity in producing steel. So you have these interesting arguments. Should you increase capacity or should you reduce capacity? And who reduces, who increases? In the case of Africa, we would like to increase capacity, not to have it reduced. And maybe as a result of some of these discussions, that can come. But the main problem, I think, right now, in terms of economic or global economy, is the sluggishness of the oil prices. A lot of countries like Nigeria, you mentioned, was depending on what? On oil. And now the oil prices are plummeted, so they have a problem just picking up. In Eastern Africa, there is a time we were very happy because you said you had found oil, so we are going to. But now it has been difficult to exploit that oil because the prices have gone down. So it will take some time before these countries can benefit from their new finds, whether it's oil or gas. And so we would hope that out of these discussions, they can find a way of stabilizing the oil prices, the gas, so that they can go back to their normal position. And then countries that needed to be boosted can be boosted by that.
All right, yeah. Great insights. Thanks very much for joining us. We are here in studio, Professor Macharia Munene.
Thank you.